Hello there, and welcome back to the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Of course, I am your host, Jay Frost, and joining me on screen in just a moment will be our guest today, who is Caroline Underwood, and I'm going to provide a little introduction to her in case you're not familiar with her work or that of her company, Philanthropy Company. But I want to welcome you first to here in England, where I'm happy to spend this week and next week having a chance to talk with some of the leaders in the field of philanthropy and fundraising and share those experiences with you. This is all courtesy of our friends over at DonorSearch, who have been allowing us to do this stuff and work in this candy store since 2016. And we've had well over 500 programs having guests talk about their experience in the world of fundraising and philanthropy. And we're doing that again for the second year, returning to the UK to have those conversations. So grateful that you can make some time for this and maybe share it with friends who may not be able to join you live, and also to participate in the discussion, which you can do two ways today. The first of which is, of course, the chat. You saw that already, and we would love it if you want to have a chance to just go down there and say hello and tell us where you're from and who you're, which organization you're with, perhaps, and where you're dialing in from. And then additionally, we also have the Q&A. And I would love it if you would use the Q&A for your questions so we don't miss them, and use the chat for the conversation that you are free to have amongst yourselves. We'll try to mine that for the conversation throughout, but of course, Q&A is a perfect place for those questions. And with that, I will finally get around to introducing our guest, Caroline Underwood, who is one of the leaders in the field of philanthropy and fundraising here in the UK and has been for a good number of years, both at the helm of Philanthropy Company, her firm, where she is CEO, but also running a number of different shops previously, before, of course, managing or guiding, I don't know which term she might prefer to use, major philanthropic efforts at some of the leading institutions, arguably not just in the UK, but in the world, who have their roots and their headquarters here in England. So Caroline, thank you so much for being here. And I think you'll have to take yourself off mute to say hello.
Well, thank you very much for asking me.
Well, it's great to have you. And now we are in two different cities today. So first of all, you're in Oxford today, is that correct? Or are you
That's
outside?
right, I am just outside Oxford, yes. Okay.
And you've spent, I know, considerable time there working with, among the many clients you've worked with, the University of Oxford. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. So I happen to live near Oxford. I've had the privilege of working with university in the past, but actually my team work all over the country and we work all over the world. So, and I also spent a lot of my working life in Sydney, Australia, which I can talk about in due course as well.
That would be a lot of fun too. Maybe we can begin by just, if you don't mind, telling us a little bit about Philanthropy Company and kind of start from there and your kind of portfolio of the different kinds of people you work with today.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So Philanthropy Company, we work with organizations large and small, all of which are charitable or not for profit. And so there might be something as significant as a multi-billion-pound campaign for a university, or it might be something like creating scholarship opportunities for a community initiative. So just right now, just to give you a sense of the kinds of scale, we're working with about 23 clients. So we're very bespoke. We are very engaged, and we are all fundraisers. The other part of Philanthropy Company that we also do is we work with family offices and with philanthropic families themselves. So we do both sides of the coin.
And I know that's something that we're going to talk about a bit, that private client work, advising philanthropists, and that's how we position some of the conversation today. But as you said, that's the other side of the coin. And as I'd like to remind people, there's always supply and demand in the world of philanthropy and fundraising. One does not really exist without the other, or maybe I shouldn't assume that. Is that as true in the UK as it is in the US, that philanthropy may exist as kind of a condition that people do want to help one another, but that fundraising is really necessary to keeping those wheels moving?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because anyone who's worked both in the UK and the US will know that in the UK, or indeed throughout Europe, so many people go, but it's so easy in America. And I'm sure the people on this call and elsewhere are kind of wincing, because there is a sort of sense that there is much more of a philanthropic embodiment that people have in the US than they do in the UK. There are obviously tax advantages and so on as well, which that's too dull to go down that route. But in answer to your question, things are changing massively here at the moment. It's been rare for people to seek professional advice for their philanthropy. That's growing now. We're following, what you've been doing across the pond in terms of philanthropic advice. But the fundraising profession here is extremely well advanced, extremely professional. And of course, what we do have as well is, at the highest level of working with donors, the majority of donors we work with are kind of global people. They might be originally from the UK or have a foot in the UK, but they are likely to be global citizens anyway. So that changes how we all work, I think.
That seems to have changed quite a bit also over the decades. That I remember some kind of, I don't know if controversy is the right word, but concerns among some people about the naming of different departments at places like Oxford in the past. And one was the business school. I remember some people having concerns about that, but now it's quite prominent, the Said Business School. And has that been an evolution of thinking, not just within a university like Oxford, but in general in philanthropy in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole piece around ethics, transparency, reputation management is a hugely significant piece for organizations and also for families. And that might go right from, yes, the association of a name with a particular building or a particular program, but it might go right through to how charities behave. We have a very agile and involved charities commission here, which looks at how charities behave and where the donations come from. And that in the last decade probably has become much more the thinking about transparency, about where donations come from, about reputational risk has become much more to the fore for people, as it should, frankly. The alignment of who's giving and where those funds are being spent is much more transparent now than it was probably 10 years ago, if not 20.
Why is that the case? What's why the greater degree of interest or focus on that?
Well, because there have been some high-profile cases. I mean, the Sackler family case was one that really drew people's attention to what was happening. But it's also happening at many other levels. And I think perhaps one of the interesting things is that if you're thinking about the world in general, you're thinking about Me Too, the Me Too movement. You might be thinking about Black Lives Matter. You might be thinking about, an increased focus on equity. That also plays into the reputation and how donors behave and what donations you're accepting. So I think it's kind of part of a bigger kind of macro trend, if you like. But the way it plays out is that it plays out in, should we be screening our donors? Yes.
And wow, there are so many things.
Sorry, that was a bit.
Oh no, that was wonderful. But it sets up a whole variety of questions I'd love to ask you. And one of them has to do with how that change is arising and whether the sensitivities and the way that we approach those issues is coming more from the guidance that's provided by people like yourself, or if it's coming from within the institutions, or maybe from the outside, from donors and the public who say, I do or do not want this kind of donor either embraced or elevated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a smart question. Look, when it goes wrong, it's a question coming from the public, isn't it? Or more importantly, from your beneficiaries, the people that you've been set up to support. And so that's when it goes wrong. Because actually, of course, the organization or indeed the trustees should have been thinking about that previously. But what I'm seeing more and more is that because of this, a lot of donors really would prefer not to have profile. They really would prefer to give privately. It's not that they want to be secret, because they realize there needs to be due diligence, but there is a risk in giving big donations, a risk to them and their family. The organization might get it wrong and so on. So, you know, there's a nuance there, I think, that perhaps there wasn't previously.
This guides us into that discussion about the private client world. And I know I believe you went to a meeting, maybe one of many that you've been to recently, dealing with issues that are particularly of interest to those who are not just managing their wealth, but managing their philanthropy, who are thinking very long-term about what is it that my family wants to be remembered for having done, among other issues. Can you give us a little window, such as you can, into the kinds of issues that they're thinking about right now and where philanthropy plays a role or maybe doesn't play a role?
No, absolutely. I mean, when we were chatting before this, I mentioned speaking in Amsterdam, and the context for that is I was very honored, really, to be invited to go to the Rijksmuseum to speak to private wealth advisors. Now, I should say that this briefing, for which there are about 200 people, was also at the same time as the Vermeer exhibition, and after me they got to see the Vermeer. So I had under no illusion that they were there to hear what I had to say. I was merely the warm-up act for you know, the most tremendous exhibition that many people will have been able to see either online or in reality. So these were people who are family office people. So either they are members of a wealthy family or they are advisors to a family office. And the question was, the sort of homework question was, what should my clients be thinking about in relation to philanthropy? I can't possibly answer that for every family, but I can share a few ideas that I hear from people. And should I just do a quick snapshot of what those are? Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, one of the things that is really exciting and actually kind of gets me out of bed in the morning is, and I'm sure, you know, anyone who's tuning in, it's also very motivating, is working with people that want to make a difference. And what people in those family offices, in those families know and realize is that, and the way they may not articulate it like this, but I think about it like this, is that family philanthropy is a force for good, right? It's a force for change. And what's even better, it sort of cements your family values between generations, between multiply, you know, complicated step families. If you can have some shared values, some shared philanthropy, it can be a fantastic bond. So that's the kind of, you know, a first hurrah thing. I kind of, sometimes people talk as if people who are giving money are kind of from another planet, you know, as if they're sort of some other aliens or something. But of course they're not. They're just people. And guess what everyone's worried about right now? You know, everybody is worried about climate change. And so thinking about, you know, what is the impact of my philanthropy on climate is something that's very, very embedded for people. And the point that I feel very strongly about, and I hope is helpful to people, is this is not, there are more people coming in and saying, yes, I'm going to support climate change initiatives. There are more donors wanting to do that. But the point is, the people who are giving to other things, education, buildings, are also thinking about climate change. So I think it's beholden on organizations that are trying to fundraise to think about how can I legitimize what we're doing in relation to climate as well, if that makes sense. So it's not just about, yes, there's more money around for environmental projects. It's also about, how does my project meet any environmental criteria, because donors want to look at that. So it's kind of an obvious one, but somehow we sort of forget it in relation to family offices. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I'm glad to hear you talk about it, because again, if there's an impression that somehow people who have a little bit of money are almost a different species, then there might be also an assumption that they are out of touch with issues like climate change. And what you're saying is, at this meeting, they were the ones talking about it.
Right.
And if that's true, it begs the question then for organizations that are thinking about approaching individuals with their projects, hopefully getting to know who they are and what their concerns are first, But once they've done that, if they think that there's some kind of match there or opportunity to discuss something with someone, they shouldn't be too cautious about talking about the big issues of the day, because they seem to be the
Right.
big issues on the minds of people with those same resources.
Right.
Yeah.
And I
So
think you've got to make your project relevant. So you've got to think about, what are the big issues of the day? Climate change. How does my project, building, program relate to that? And the other thing that I would absolutely say is on the minds of philanthropists, and well, on all our minds, and long overdue, I would say, is about equality, equity, impact. These are very much on the minds of philanthropists as well as in the media and in our fundraising thinking as well. So there's kind of some, what would be the right word, qualifiers, I suppose, that I think we should all be thinking about, which are kind of macro issues, before we start thinking about I need to raise $100,000 for my particular project.
now you set up this particular part of the conversation as family offices. And for those who aren't familiar with that environment, I know you can't speak for all family offices everywhere, but can you give a picture about what a family office is and how those of us on the outside of that world might interact with them, if at all, in order to then talk about these issues that are meaningful to the donors and to us?
Yeah, I should have said families and family offices. So the people we work with are either families where we work with them directly, or you're working with. So a family office tends to be, it's probably a much more technical description than I'm going to give you, but it tends to be the people that are advising a family, and that tends to be people who are advising in a legal capacity, financial capacity, all the things to do with running a family business. Sometimes they might have a philanthropy advisor, but often they haven't. And certainly, I mean, in the US, the giving philanthropy advice is much more mature than it is here. There's only a handful of people giving philanthropic advice here in an independent way, although a number of the banks and others will have people on their team who can do that. So it's basically just working with families.
And that's something that's good to hear in more detail as well, in that we may have had the experience that sometimes financial advisors, strictly speaking, even if they're acting as fiduciaries, their primary role would be to help the individuals and families protect their assets, not necessarily to advise them on how to give money away. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the individuals don't want to do it. But you've got this person there who's helping them to preserve their families' assets and hopefully then their legacy. So can those offices, when the external parties there, can they be a helpful intermediary, or are they all sometimes a barrier? And how do you?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I certainly think it's worth getting to know. Well, I mean, as you know, many family trusts have a advisor or an external person on them. I certainly think it's worth thinking about who is advising this family. Have they got any responsibility for philanthropy? Sometimes sometimes the fundraisers we work with are very focused on all those advisors, and I'm not sure how useful that is as a route. It's certainly useful to have some friendly lawyers and some friendly finance advisors around, but I'm not sure that that's really the right focus, because, as you say, they're in a way they can be a barrier, or they can be a real support, if they're passionate about what you're doing. I would say the other thing that is very much top of mind is that, of course, we've got this extraordinary across the world transference of wealth, haven't we, where it's going to the next gen, and that is changing how people give as well. I'm happy to say that some of the patriarchy is shifting aside for some of the kind of next generational thinking. I was working with a family recently, and they've always supported things like the opera and universities and their children. I say children, but these are young people. I think they're 17, 19 and 22 or something. They don't want to support those things anymore. They want to support grassroots change. They don't want to be giving money away as giving money. They want to be actually working in the community as well as giving money. So there's lots of really hopeful green shoots. And I know I sound like the eternal optimist, but I've been a fundraiser for all my life, so you kind of have to be.
Absolutely. It's great to also hear you talking about people in their teens and 20s as philanthropists or as people searching to make their mark on the things that matter. And
Right.
that's very meaningful. And it seems like an opening for organizations that might otherwise be thinking, well, we have to do the same old thing again.
Right. No.
That's a good thing. I wonder if you're seeing changes that are also demographic in nature in terms of this audience. So if in the past, for example, a lot of wealth in the United States was held primarily among, one kind of cohort, but our change demographically speaking has been rather dramatic in the last several decades, and it will be even more so in the coming years. And one of the questions is, well, are the people who are coming up, are they as interested in philanthropy? And now you've been talking about a microcosm of people who definitely have money, and that transfer is going to them. Well, what about the other people in the UK, that growing, more diverse population of people who are, of course, just as engaged with the world, if not more so, but they aren't necessarily engaged with the organizations that we know? Are they as interested in philanthropy? And if so, what form is that taking? How can we engage them more?
Yeah, I'm so happy and excited about this. I'm glad you asked about it, because what I'm seeing, and what I'm not articulating brilliantly yet, but what I'm seeing is a kind of philanthropic activism, right? So people want to do something. They don't want to just give money. So if you think about what's happening in the UK, we've got a lot of public campaigns going on. We've got Just Stop Oil. We've got, the one I always think about is the Me Too movement, where, people were properly angry and properly taking action, but that also came with money. To really try and make change, you have to have some resource behind you. So I think that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing that much more, that people want to be active in their philanthropy and not just kind of, distributing largesse. And of course, that comes to a much deeper involvement, hopefully a much deeper understanding. There's a whole nother conversation around giving fairly and how funds are distributed, but that's what I'm seeing as a change. I don't know what that does in demographics. What I do know is that there is a massive rise in women giving, and in fact, I've a colleague of mine, Philip Martovici, and I wrote a chapter in a book which I can send you the link for, which is about how women are taking a more and more active role in philanthropy, not just because they're spending other people's money, but because they are spending their own money, and they are really looking into what's happening and really wanting to make change. And that's a massive shift from a generation ago, and I think we'll start to see big changes along the way.
That's such an important way to frame maybe even a discussion about leadership within our organizations, because whether it's a campaign, and you've been part of many of those, or whether it's thinking about the next generation of leadership on our boards, that our organizations are going to have to issue invitations to people they haven't before. And women certainly are in prominent roles within the nonprofit world, but they could be in more of those roles, especially leading our organizations. But that's also true for many other populations that have been ignored, including younger people, like the ones you were mentioning a few minutes ago. So are you finding in the UK that organizations are saying, okay, it's time, we better start inviting younger and more diverse people to serve on our boards and our campaign committees?
I mean, yes, there is still a long way to go. But yes, everybody is trying to do that, or says they're trying to do that, and there's an urgency to do that. But there is, change happens very slowly. What I would sort of segue to is that the fundraising profession, the advancement profession, is predominantly a female environment. And that, I mean, I spend a lot of my life not in a, I mean, I suppose it is in a professional way, but not in a paid way, in a free way, I should say, coaching people or mentoring people. And those are mostly women, and they mostly are saying, look, I've been working in this fundraising job for 10 years. I've, work full time in the office every evening, and I just can't do it anymore. Partly about family, but not only. It's also about elderly parents. It's also about, doing a postgrad. And so there's a strange thing to kind of, wrap your arms around, which is that fundraising tends to be heavily female dominated. There tend to be lots of offices that are predominantly women, not all, but predominantly. And, why are those women not necessarily pushing through and becoming the chief executive, or why are they not on the campaign boards for others? What we have seen in the UK is we've seen in the last 5 years, maybe a bit longer, what we have seen is more fundraising professionals join the boards of big organizations. So, I mean, speaking personally, I was deputy chair of UNICEF. And my role when I joined was to really bring in a sort of fundraising knowledge. But of course, you can't sit on a board without a much rounder approach. So I might have a technical expertise, but actually it's a much rounder governance expertise. So I think there are some examples of people pushing through, but yes, it's mighty slow.
And just a historical footnote on this, because this is so important, what you're talking about. So you were also heavily involved in Save the Children, a global organization founded by a woman in the UK, but for many years, and I think we probably both share a deep affection for and respect for Save the Children, but for many years, largely led by men, at least in the United States and other places, good leaders, but for that kind of leadership now, female leadership in the US, for example, and other places, this has been a long way coming to have people like yourself serving these roles on boards and at the executive chair in the major NGOs.
Well, I'd say that was a step, but of course now it's much more important to have Southern world leadership and to have more diverse leadership and so on. But yes, just going back to Save the Children, when I joined, it was run by a woman. It was run by a fantastic woman called Jasmine Whitbread, and had a pretty balanced leadership. But I take your point, absolutely. I do take your point. What we used to see, and I'll probably get shot by all my fundraising colleagues, but we used to see a lot of senior advancement roles occupied by men, and then an all-female team reporting to them. So I think that is changing. Yeah. Because talent is, I don't know, I mean, I understand there's a similar issue in the US. Certainly in the UK, there is a massive shortage of talented, experienced fundraisers who have got a track record, particularly working with major donors. There's a huge shortage of people, not just people with the talent, but people who actually want to do it, because it's exhausting, isn't it? And hard work, and you need to be very committed to the cause. But there's a real shortage of people.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about why that's the case. What you're seeing as the major factors that are causing people to either leave the profession or not to enter it in the first place, particularly among women or people of color, for example. What are the barriers to either advancement or to even entry?
I mean, one of the things is, and this sounds, in some ways, I feel very old-fashioned saying this, but I'm afraid it's still true, is that in a lot of organizations, fundraising isn't valued. It's seen as a kind of, I've even had people say to me, it's a necessary evil. It's seen as a kind of almost a side activity. And that's incredibly dispiriting if you are in one of those roles. Mm-hmm. In other organizations, you're at the top table and people absolutely get how important it is and so on. I don't think there are barriers to joining. I mean, there are more and more people coming in at the entry level, which is fantastic. I just think expectations are high. The donor pool is shrinking. The number of organizations is increasing. I think there's 175,000 charities in the UK right now. And the big change we have seen is more leaders, more trustees understanding about fundraising. But if you haven't got somebody you're working with who understands the value you're bringing alongside, your other colleagues, that can be quite dispiriting, because anyone who's been in a fundraising role, and I've been in many, knows that you have to get used to quite a lot of knockbacks, quite a lot of joy and quite a lot of knockbacks as well. So I think, I'm afraid I have to say, I think it's still an undervalued profession.
And well, as leading your own firm, I'm sure that when you're thinking about recruitment, what is that like for you? Because you're also,
I don't get to
you're looking for senior level people because of the nature of your work. So how is it to try and find talent for you or your clients?
Yeah, that's a good. Luckily, I'm the chief exec, so I'm the worst. I probably beat myself up more than. That's a figurative expression, but I probably give myself a harder time than if I had a chief exec I was reporting to. I mean, there are some fantastically talented people. We are a very strong team, and what may or may not be interesting for people to know is that, and I don't think you know this, Jay, because we don't know each other well, but I thought about setting up my consultancy for a long time. I had a number of in-house roles. I then worked on a campaign, a theatre campaign. Well, I actually worked at the Royal Court Theatre with a man called Stephen Daldry. And it was the first capital campaign that needed to raise significant funds for a lottery. But because they paid me so little, I also consulted sort of, additionally on the weekend. And I worked for a consultancy running a capital campaign in another city. And when I was doing that, I kept thinking, there's a huge need here. People keep asking me how to raise money for theatres. So eventually I set up my own consultancy and launched it, and had, it was quite tough to leave a salaried job and launch yourself on the world. And the complexity of that is that I launched the company. I had 3 clients, I think, and then I discovered I was pregnant with twins. So I actually kind of think I have 3 babies, really, my twins and the company. So yeah, and now, so the company has just been 20, it's nearly 21, and there's a parallel there. So I've juggled, and I think many of us, every woman or every person everywhere has to juggle, but I have juggled along the way with the fundraising and with bringing up children as a single parent. So it's been a challenge, and it's huge privilege for me with the company in terms of the talent, in that I really do. One of the things that we can provide for people is proper flexibility, and we really pride ourselves on that. And it's not that, I mean, we're uber professional. We deliver fantastic work. Many of our clients stay with us for years, but we are able to provide proper flexibility, not only for women, but also for people who have caring responsibilities, or want to run a marathon, or whatever it is. So we one of the to your question about talent, we look for talent in all directions, all shapes and sizes, all over the place. But we are able to offer proper flexibility, which I think is hugely valued by people.
And this is not an invitation for everyone watching this to suddenly submit a resume, but it does speak to how a company can be run, but also, I guess, how nonprofits or charitable organizations, both here in the UK, but also in the United States, and we have 1.5 million who struggle with this issue, how they can provide an environment where, whether, as you said, people have caring responsibilities, or they have children, or they want to run a marathon. Actually, someone just wrote about it today, about the importance of sabbaticals,
right,
which is almost unheard of, at least in the US, for nonprofit employees, sometimes at some higher education institutions. But even that is a relative rarity for fundraising or advancement staff. higher ed. Are there different things that you see organizations here doing that help to retain staff or even help to bolster them so they have the strength they need to do what they need to do?
Yeah,
Whether
I mean, look,
increasing
I just,
salaries or whatever?
well, I just think that well, there's been some research done here by the recruitment agencies about salaries and so on. I mean, it's always happening, isn't it? But my own experience is that people, yes, that's critically important. Of course, it's critically important to be valued, but actually, most of us are motivated by the cause. Most of us are motivated by making a difference. And so if you're passionate about trying to create something, that's a huge motivation. I described my career before I started consulting, and indeed during consulting, is I've been lucky enough to work with so many people with unbelievable vision, unbelievable determination, sometimes literally anger, wanting to make change. And I've been privileged to help them do that. Right.
That kind of passion really counts for a lot in this profession. There ought to be a way that we can stoke that fire. There is something else that I know would fascinate a lot of people in the U.S., and that has to do with your work and working with royals, for example. That the only equivalent we might have is working with celebrities, and I don't think it's exactly the same. So maybe since you've worked with both, can you give us a little window on how that adds a dimension to the work, to the opportunities for nonprofits, but also maybe the fun, something that gives us a reason to stick around and do something interesting and perhaps a little bit different?
You mean how many times have I been to Buckingham Palace?
Sure, we can start there.
Yeah, well, I mean, how to phrase this? I mean, having a royal patron in the UK is not something that everybody wants, but it can have a massive impact on fundraising. And I mean, you mentioned Save the Children. I had the privilege of working with, and actually kind of, it was my job to make sure that it all worked with Her Royal Highness Princess Anne, who you may know is the Queen's daughter. She's also a very serious equestrian, and works incredibly hard for Save the Children and indeed for other charities. And most donors, not all donors, some people don't, some people it's not their thing, but others do like to be invited to a palace. And the royal family work incredibly hard to support that, and to make sure that they are representing the charities that they support. And if you look at obviously we have a relatively new king in the UK, and I mean he's been a huge charity advocate over the years, and continues his commitment to environmental charities and so on. I mean, on a personal level, I've had the opportunity to be at a number of donor dinners, donor events, private tours, and it can just help you draw attention to your cause or your charity. But I would say this is not tokenism. I mean, the royal family that I've had the privilege of working with, they really know what they are involved with, and they really know the charities they're involved with. You do need to be on your toes. It's not just a kind of figurehead activity for many of them. So does it help to have celebrities, politicians, members of the royal family involved? Yes, it always does. Is there a risk? Of course, because if somebody's star falls, that can damage your charity too.
Right. And I know we don't need to get into the details of that, because once again, that can happen to all different sorts of people who align with us or we align with. But it does maybe bring up another question, which is, how do you prepare for those kinds of crises? I mean, that's something that I'm sure that you've encountered along the way, working within organizations, but also with your clients. And I don't mean just with attaching to a star that's falling, but with all sorts of things, like everything we've talked about in this conversation, whether it's finally people gaining recognition that the environmental crisis is is so enormous and that something must be done yesterday. But also all the other issues mentioned, from Me Too to Black Lives Matter, all these things which suddenly took on a greater public discussion, I should say, about these issues, especially in COVID. As you've worked with so many different kinds of organizations, and they have to be nimble in order to address what people gain recognition of, how do you do that? How do you help organizations to be nimble, to be aware, and to be forward-looking?
Yeah. I mean, look, the single biggest thing that we tell people, and this was particularly relevant during COVID, but we are actually quite bad at it in general, is to talk to and engage with your donors. It sounds so obvious, but during COVID, there were quite a number of organizations that said, oh, we're not going to contact our donors because we don't want to ask them for money. We're going to stop fundraising. And many boards said to their fundraisers, stop fundraising. I'm afraid we didn't agree with that. We were the antithesis to that. We were actually, okay, you might change your campaign, but you have to communicate with your donors even more so. And what could be easier? I mean, COVID opened up this opportunity to do these Zooms, to do things that we hadn't done before. So our advice to any of our clients, and it's not exactly rocket science, but most people do it badly, and it plays into the kind of conversations you've been having with others as well, is you have to take your donors with you. And I am always horrified by how little thanking there is of donors in a even if there are many thousands of them, how little thanking, how little briefing, how little telling them what's going on. So it's always about keep your donors close, and in a crisis, just keep them even closer.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of this, Caroline. Really do appreciate it, and your time and all the work that you're doing. If people want to know more about the firm or follow your activities, how can they do that?
Yeah, thank you very much. So it's www.philanthropycompany.com. And please do follow either the company or me or both on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Always happy to, chat about things via LinkedIn. So yeah, very happy to hear from people, but do please look us up.
And I know Jack is putting that in the chat, so thank you for that, Jack. I want to thank you again, Caroline, so much for taking the time to do this. And I hope that people will take you up on that offer and will follow your work. It's something we can certainly learn from. And I want to thank all of you for joining us, whether you're here with us live or you're watching this after the fact. I hope you'll join us again for the sessions we have coming up next week, right here in London and in Germany. So you'll enjoy those on Tuesday and Thursday, plus some other recordings we'll be doing along the path, which will be part of our podcast series. That's all part of the Philanthropy Mastermind series, which you can see all of over at DonorSearch.net under the resources tab or on YouTube. And our thanks once again to DonorSearch for letting us have conversations like this one. We look forward to seeing you all soon. Until then, take care. Thank you, Caroline.
Goodbye.
Bye.